One of the big draws of TF2 is the weapon system. Each class can swap their run-of-the-mill stock weapon for something that changes how they play the game entirely. Want to trade off self-defense for the ability to support your team? Sure, just swap your shotgun out for a banner. Forcing people to trade off certain strengths for others adds a big strategic element to how you build your loadout, and in my opinion, it's a large part of what's made TF2 last so long. But of course, we don't care about any of that. We're here to throw balance out the window and see what happens. What if instead of the standard primary, secondary, and melee system, each unique type of weapon instead had its own reserve slot? This would obviously let each class equip a lot of weapons at the same time, but how crazy would this actually end up being? Well, that's what I want to theorycraft, and considering the sorts of weapons that are available, this was a lot more interesting than I first thought it would be. So, first of all, let's discuss exactly how this would work. The main idea is that every type of weapon that functions completely differently from stock would get their own brand new slot. This means that stuff like banners would have their own dedicated weapon slot, but shotgun side grades that are only slight variations of stock like the reserve shooter would still be part of the shotgun slot. Now, despite the title referencing 4 weapon slots, this actually means that a few classes get significantly more. 4 is actually the minimum each class would get, not the standard. So, let's go through each class, figure out how many slots they'd have, and consider how much the game would break if you actually let them do that. Side note, there unfortunately will not be any testing in this video because, as it turns out, adding new weapon slots in source mod is way harder than it has any right to be. Maybe eventually I'll try to have it modded in if people like the concept, but for now we're just gonna stick to theory crafting and call it a day. So, first off, Scout. Scout's weapons can be pretty cleanly broken down into 5 distinct categories. Scouter guns, which includes all of his primaries, pistols, pretty self-explanatory, throwables, or the Mad Milk and the Flying Guillotine, sodas, which again are pretty obvious, and the melees, which once again encompasses all of his options. So with that distribution, Scout would effectively have a primary, a melee, and then 3 secondary slots. And dear God, considering his arsenal, a Scout with 3 secondaries would be absolutely terrifying to play against. You no longer have to make the difficult decision between a team support option, a personal utility, and mid-range damage. You just have all 3 at the same time, which would vastly expand the ways you're able to play him. Want to be an absolute menace at flanking? Bonk behind enemy lines and keep yourself alive with a Mad Milk and pocket pistol. Want to do insane mid-range damage? Use the shortstop, criticola, pistol, and flying guillotine. There would be a ton of fun new loadouts created from this, and considering the utility you'd have at your disposal at all times, you could make about any weapon you wanted to work. Now, as far as what the best weapons for each slot would be, I'd imagine that the scatter guns wouldn't change much, and your melees would be entirely based around whatever else you're running. All 3 pistols would be equally as viable, with the winger getting used as your main mobility tool now that you're not sacrificing as much to run it. The best throwable would easily be the Mad Milk, since you don't need the extra mid-range damage from the cleaver and the heal on hit is busted, and the best soda would be really whichever one you need for the current game, but probably the bonk in general since it's more versatile. Either way, you are getting insane value out of nearly every available option because Scout's secondaries in general are really good. But even though this would make Scout rather powerful, how would he stack up against the other classes? Well, to compare how powerful I think each class would be, I am once again bringing out the forbidden format. Dread it, run from it, the tier list arrives all the same. Here's the tier list that I'm going to be going with, and considering the tiers, I'll probably put Scout in incredibly powerful. Even though he would be really good, I can't immediately think of several other classes that would be significantly better. Overall, still a high score, but nowhere near broken considering the competition. Soldier is an absolute beast in this scenario, coming pre-packaged with 5 available weapon slots that all offer insane utility. You have rocket launchers, which are all of your primaries, shotguns, which are the 3 actual shotguns in the Righteous Bison, banners, which are the 3 banners, melees, which are all of your melees, and finally what I'm calling passives, or the 3 items that you can't hold that are physically worn on your character. Now, there's definitely an argument to be made that either the Righteous Bison or the Base Jumper should be their own weapon slots separate from the others, but trust me when I say that on top of not really mattering because they're not great weapons, Soldier does not need the extra utility at all. Even with the minimalist distribution, you could run a shotgun, a banner, and the gunboats all at the same time. That would be so unfathomably broken since it would effectively remove all of Soldier's weaknesses. Hell, even having just the gunboats be its own slot would be incredible, since the main downside of running the frankly incredible shotguns and banners is that your mobility is a lot more costly. Having practically free mobility, a fantastic hit scan self-defense tool, and some of the most powerful team support options in the entire game packed into a single kit would easily make Soldier the most powerful character in this scenario. As far as what the best weapons are, my personal picks would be stock for your primary, anything that's not the Bison for your shotgun slot, really any of the banners, but probably the Battalion's backup or the Conch for your banner, easily the gunboats for your passive slot, and probably the escape plan, market gardener, or disciplinary action for your melee. Really though, as long as you're running the gunboats, you're going to be insanely powerful with any loadout you're running. I know people think the gunboats are overrated, but I firmly believe that doubling your mobility really is just that good. So we'll go ahead and put Soldier in the broken tier where he belongs. Pyro is a very interesting class to do this with because he's the first class to get 6 slots instead of the normal 5. You've got the flamethrowers, shotguns, flare guns, and melees, which are all pretty distinct, but Pyro also has the thermal thruster and the gas passer, which function completely differently not only from each other, but also everything else mentioned. This means that in addition to the 4 just mentioned, Pyro would also get a jetpack slot and a throwable slot that contain exactly 1 weapon each. Now, even though I don't think this would make him as good as Soldier, a Pyro with effectively 4 secondary slots would be insane. The reason Pyro is the worst class in the game at the moment, and yes, he's worse than Spy, come fight me, is that he is incredibly dependent on his secondary choice, with each weapon you choose having massive opportunity costs. costs. A shotgun means you lose a lot of range, a flare gun means you lose a lot of consistency, and the thermal thruster means you lose a lot of damage. No matter what you pick, you're missing out on something crucial, so having flares for long range, shotguns for mid-range, and a jetpack for mobility would make Pyro ridiculously versatile. Hell, even the gas passer would immensely benefit from its own slot, since in addition to being able to recharge it with flares, you're not giving up any of your actually good weapons to run it. Sure, it still wouldn't be amazing, but at least it would be a free way to help add damage into team fights. As far as what the best weapons for Pyro would be, I'd say that outside of your melee, you could get away running literally whatever you wanted. Even though some weapons like the reserve shooter might be a little bit more niche, the fact that you're giving up significantly less to run each secondary means that you don't have to worry about versatility on each weapon. Overall though, I don't think this quite pushes Pyro into the broken tier, because even though these changes would remove a lot of weaknesses the class has, I don't think it would carry his team as much as Soldier. So I'll go ahead and put him right below Scout and incredibly powerful. As is the case in most of these videos, Demo Man becomes absolutely insane if you give him access to everything at the same time. Now, unlike most other classes, there is a bit of debate as to how many slots Demo should get. He has the obvious ones like grenade launchers, passives, sticky bomb launchers, and shields, but then you look at the melees and realize that they could really go either way. The question is, are swords different enough from the bottle to justify taking up a different weapon slot? While you could argue that they all have distinct traits that set them up as their own weapon type, I think a major distinguishing factor is missing from them. Most other quote-unquote alternative playstyle weapons don't actually list the changes from stock in their stats. I guess it's assumed that the alternative weapons act as the base for their own weapon type, meaning they can't be compared to stock in any meaningful way. However, every single sword is directly compared to the stock melee by listing exactly what it does differently, leading me to believe that they should all share a single melee slot. I know it's somewhat petty reasoning, but it's literally the only thing that I have to make the decision not completely arbitrary. So we'll stick with 5 total slots on Demo and call it a day. Upon actually looking at how these slots interact though, it is very clear that he does not need a 6th slot whatsoever. Like normal, he's able to run a grenade launcher and sticky bomb launcher of his choice, which are 2 of the most powerful weapon types in the game. However, on top of that, he also gets a passive 25 max health and 10% faster movement speed on top of the resistances from whatever shield he may be running. And his shield also gives him completely free mobility on top of his existing ability to sticky jump, meaning that Demo Man in this scenario is tankier and arguably just as mobile as Soldier with higher DPS to boot. However, while I am going to put Demo Man in completely broken, I don't think he's better than Soldier for 2 main reasons. First of all, access to banners is massive, since on top of granting a huge buff to yourself, they're arguably one of the best team support options in the entire game. Demo would do a ton of damage, but when it comes to actually doing the objective, he wouldn't be as powerful as Soldier. And second, access to reliable hit scan and resistance to your own explosives mean that Soldier practically has 0 weaknesses, while even with the extra Demo Knight stuff, Demo is still susceptible to getting rushed down at closer ranges. So while Soldier has a winning matchup against nearly every class, Demo still has a lot of trouble with Scouts and Pyros. Either way though, it barely matters. If you pick Demo Man, you're gonna get carried. My guess for the best weapons would be that the grenade and sticky bomb choices would be the same as normal, the boots would infinitely outclass the base jumper, and your melee and shield would literally be whatever you wanted. If I had to pick, the Tide Turner and the Claymore would be optimal since you're basically playing souped up Hybrid Knight, but other than that, it could really go either way. But yeah, with 5 slots, you could play full Demo Man and full Demo Knight at the same time, and I don't think I'd have to explain why that's incredibly busted. Heavy is a rather boring class to do this with, because as he is, he barely has any gameplay defining weapons. The 4 slots you get are pretty basic: miniguns, shotguns, sandwiches, and melees. However, what's unique to Heavy is that implementing this exact change is that something that people have been asking for years. According to the pro lunchbox slot people, letting Heavy equip a sandwich and a shotgun at the same time would open up a lot of versatility as to how you can play the class. And while the idea is certainly cool in concept, I hate to burst your bubbles, but it really would not do that much for Heavy. Sure, it'd give him a second damage source, since otherwise you'd never be running a shotgun to begin with, but when you compare the amount of time that it takes to switch to your shotgun to the amount of time that it takes to rev your minigun, you'll notice that with everything but the brass piece, it's usually just more efficient to jump rev toward your enemy. The shotgun would have the niche use of being better if you're switching from your melee, but the only time you're encountering that scenario is if you're running back to the front lines or retreating from a horrible position. So no, I don't think giving Heavy a sandwich slot would fix the fundamental issues with the class like many people claim that it would. However, it would make him marginally better than he currently is, so I'll put him in the decent improvement tier. The best weapons for 4 slots are identical to the best weapons for 3. Heavy really does not have that many unique weapon synergies that would be fun or interesting with the new slot. I'm sure the 4 Fat Scout mains would have a field day with this change, but if you're playing Heavy optimally, it is virtually identical to how it is now. Engineer was rather annoying to do this with, because whether his secondaries are in the same category is so ambiguous that I'm not really sure how many slots he should get. Technically speaking, he already has 5 slots, the 2 PDAs filling the space. However, since there's only 1 PDA slot in your loadout menu, I'm going to assume the construction and destruction PDAs are part of the same overall weapon. So on top of a shotgun, pistol, wrench, and PDA slot, he'd also get a 5th Wrangler slot, since that's different enough from the pistol to count. The problem arises when we get to the short circuit though. Once again, we face the question of whether this thing is comparable enough to stock to be the same type of weapon. And contrary to what you might think, I personally believe that it is. Similar to the Demo Man swords, the short circuit shares a lot of its operating numbers with the stock pistol, and it very clearly compares itself to it when listing what it can do. Again, this could just be semantics, but I think it's slightly better reasoning than just saying what vibes it gives off. However, I barely think whether the short circuit gets its own slot matters, because what's important is that you can use it at the same time as is the Wrangler. Having to fight an engineer using both the short circuit and the Wrangler to keep his buildings alive sounds frankly horrid. Especially if you had a second engineer giving repairs, this combo would make your buildings ridiculously tanky. And even for a loadout like Battle NG, being able to have a reliable mid-range tool and wrangle your own minis would be huge. That said, when considering the other classes he'd be up against, I don't think this is anywhere close to game-breaking, especially when you consider the amount of battalions backups you'd see active. So I'll put him at the very top of decent improvement. If you play engineer and think he should be higher, feel free to comment your reasoning, but that's personally what I'm going with. Medic is a class you would initially think wouldn't get any changes at all. All of his slots seem to only have a single type of weapon, with any major playstyle changes coming from player choice rather than the loadout you're running. However, what I think would be really interesting is if we divided a single primary slot into separate syringe gun and crossbow slots. Even though the crossbow is close enough to stock to probably not count if we're doing things correctly, I do think this would give some syringe guns the chance to actually be useful. If you were guaranteed to have the crossbow on you at all times, you'd be a lot more free to try out the 3 syringe guns for self-defense. Now on paper, this seems like a super easy way to spice up the class and give him more variety in his gameplay. However, in practice, I think this would have the exact same problems as what I mentioned with Heavy. Medic is rarely in a position where he wants to stand his ground and defend himself. Usually if you encounter enemies, you want to get the hell out of there and save your Uber. And even in those rare times you're forced to fight for your life, I usually find that your melee and crossbow are plenty good enough at combat to get you by. Even if Medic had a readily available syringe gun, I still think he'd want to get free Uber from his melee instead of trying to gun people down with the janky projectiles. That's not to say that it couldn't work. In fact, I love running the Blitzsauger since it's cracked at combat once you get the hang of it, but practically speaking, it would almost never be worth it. So out of the 3 syringe guns, I'd honestly say the Overdose would be the best option since it would be free mobility with minimal opportunity cost. You could try to run the more combat-oriented ones, but on a class like Medic, free movement speed is way too good to pass up. The Blitzsauger does provide you with pretty good healing, but more often than not, you're gonna die a lot faster than you can heal yourself. So having said all that, I'll put him right behind Heavy and decent improvement, because if nothing else, this would give him better utility. Sniper comes out of the gate swinging with 6 total weapons that all grant him something insane. His slots would be rifles, pretty obvious, bows, which would just be the Huntsman, SMGs or the Stock and Cleaner's Carbine, throwables or the Girardi, backpacks, which are obviously the 3 backpacks, and melee, which are all of his melee options. Pretty straightforward categories overall. Now, Sniper's main weakness is that he has a lot of trouble at certain ranges, with his choice of secondary being very important as to how he wants to defend himself. However, with these rules, he'd have so much random stuff packed into his kit at all times that he would have insane combat capability at any range he wanted. Long range is covered by the rifles, mid to long range is covered by the Huntsman, mid to close range is dealt with by the SMGs, and at close range you'd have the Girardi and Bushwhacker. And on top of all of that, he gets to negate a single one of his counters for free, yippee. I don't think I would have to explain why this would make Sniper absolutely broken. We'll go ahead and put him in the top tier right behind Soldier and Demo. His best weapons would be interesting, because if the Huntsman counts toward rifle headshots, I could easily see the Bizarre Bargain being the far and away winner. However, assuming that's not the case, I do think you could get use out of really whichever rifle you wanted. Even the Sydney Sleeper could be followed up by a mini-crit Huntsman arrow. Huntsman and Girardi are alone in their slots, so those are obvious, and the SMG is usually better than the Cleaners. However, I could see the utility that mini-crits would give you being useful. Your backpack would obviously depend on what sort of clashes you're fighting, but your melee would nearly always be the Bushwhacker. You're guaranteed to have the Girardi with you might as well trivialize close range fights with the guaranteed crits. But yeah, overall, Sniper would be a monster, and I could easily see him being the best damage dealer in the entire game. And finally, Spy would have 5 entire weapon slots in this scenario. You'd have revolvers, which would be all of your revolvers, sappers, which would be both your sappers, knives, which would include all of your knives, watches, which would be your 3 watches, and then the disguise kit, which would be alone in its own slot. Hey, hold on a second. Yeah, so Spy doesn't have any alternative playstyle weapons at all. Oops. You could technically make an argument that the Dead Ringer counts, but it is way closer to the rest of the watches than something like the Huntsman is to the rest of the Sniper rifles. And on top of that, there's nothing in his kit that makes me want to bend the rules because it's interesting. So it pains me to end off the list like this, but Spy is going in no change with no further elaboration. Anyway, that's what I think would happen if you gave every unique weapon type its own equip slot. Obviously, this would be a little bit crazy, so I am not in any way arguing for this to be added to the game in any capacity, with the exception of maybe the thermal thruster or the gas passer. As I mentioned in the beginning, testing something like this would take exponentially more work than the experiments that I've done in the past. If people really like the concept, I'll consider doing an experiment video in the future, but for now I can pretty accurately predict what each class would do. If you'd like to dispute my tier placements or just post funny weapon combos you can think of, feel free to list them in the comments. I love reading through your comments to see what kind of fun stuff you come up with. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like. If you hated this video, you can come complain to me at these coordinates, and most importantly, have a good one.